Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Occidental Center for the Arts' first in-person literary event in 18 months. Yeah, pretty excited. We went a conversation with Susan M. Gaines and Maya Khosla with moderator Ray Holley, guiding a fascinating and informative discussion on when literature meets science. Both women are deeply versed in biology, ornithology, and the ethos of nature. Susan M. Gaines' recent novel, Accidentals, on the table there, if you'd like to take a look or buy a copy, weaves together bird and wetlands biology, a history of South American political repression, and a compelling family saga. Ecologist Maya Khosla's poetry is informed by years of fieldwork in untouched forests that support high biodiversity after wildfire. Their respective bios are impressive. Ms. Gaines' books include the novels Accidental and Carbon Dreams, and the science book Echoes of Life. Her stories and essays have appeared in many literary journals and anthologies, and has been nominated for 2 Pushcart Prizes. She's the initiator of the International Fiction Meets Science program and the recipient of a Suffrage Science Award and of an Art in Science Fellowship at the Hansa Institute for Advanced Study in Germany. Gaines has spent much of her adult life abroad, but she always returns to Sonoma County, where she lived for over a decade. Welcome back. Yeah. Ms. Khosla is a wildlife biologist and writer. She's currently working on a film about being fire-wise. Her books include All the Fires of Wind and Light, which you'll also see on the table for sale, or just briefly look at them. Poetry from Fires of Wind and Light is from 16 Rivers Press. 2020 Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award. Keel Bone, poetry from Bear Star Press, Dorothy Brunsman Poetry Prize, and Web of Water, Life in Redwood Creek, Golden Gate Parks Conservancy. Sonoma County Conservation Council selected Maya as one of the 2020 Environmentalists of the Year. She served as our Poet Laureate of Sonoma County from 2018 to 2020, organizing a series of filmed readings to bring Sonoma's communities together after the 2017 fires. Her poems have been featured in documentary films and in many journals. Ray Holley is a Sonoma County native. He wrote for, edited, and managed weekly newspapers for 2 decades, and now works as the communications manager for the Sonoma County Library. Thank you, Ray.
So, how about now? Thank you. So before we start, let's take a breath, center ourselves in this beautiful space, and be ready to listen and learn. I was thinking we want to thank all of our 2-legged friends and our 4-legged friend, and all the 2-legged and 4-legged friends in the forest above us. We're in their space today, and we're grateful. If you want to shift around, put on a jacket, take off a jacket, do what you need to do to be comfortable and present. We have a rare opportunity this afternoon to hear from 2 scientists who are also extraordinary storytellers. Maya and Susan are going to share with us their visions of the natural world and let us experience how they see it and how they write about it. Let's start with a poem.
Well, thanks, Ray. Thank you, Sis. It's great to be here in this beautiful space, and especially framed by the woods, which is going to be my first poem, the opening. I'm opening with the woods, specifically the bird world, because the bird world actually originally guided me in really understanding the woods much better, especially the woods that we are surrounded by in California, which experience wildfire. And so, rejuvenation. Once we have looked away Once we have mourned and banished all smoldering thoughts about the tribe of blackened trees, replacing the known world for now and another season, and the last long fingers of smoke have been ushered out by wind, a ticking begins. No one has seen them arriving in such numbers, but the birds are neither lost nor passing through. They're simply linked tight to the newborn sense of ash and rain, to the promise of white fruits, the riches concealed by bark. So were the ways of ancestors who began their journeys as specks in the distance some 50,000 years ago or more, riding the miles of smoky gray, smoky gold along a known line of hunger, growing closer and closer, the rufous beat of instinct, working a migration against the flow of smoke into the source and its multiple treasures. One new arrival looks bright with hope. He paints his dusk and opal plumage. Others tap as if knocking on doors. The answers are being provided by the ages, delicate at genetic fibers coiled around every cell, beak and bone, muscle and shiny eye. The living are awake to the growth and profusion soon to follow. They will grow with the diligence of all known colors unfurling, from the soil's chocolatey darkness, from the trees regreening comes spring, from the blackness.
Let's leave the woods and travel south into the marsh.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Suze. This really is a homecoming for me. I'm going to read from a 350-page novel, so I had to excise a few pages that I hope will give you a sense of the weave of science, natural history, with character and plot in this book. There's a few things you need to know. Gabriel, our narrator, is 23 years old, was raised in California, and has been birdwatching since he was a child. His mother is from the tiny South American country of Uruguay, and he's down there visiting family, exploring the marshes on an old ranch, an old estancia that his family owns, when he meets Alejandra, who's a local microbiologist who's been studying the ecology of the rice fields around his family's land. Gabe's been helping her collect samples, showing her the bird life in the marsh, and of course, hoping to get her interested in something besides birds and microbes. Hey, it's 23. I'd been birding the same area for the past 3 days, working my way up the creek and picking painstakingly through the reeds and around the pond to the rail's nest. I always saw something new, but sharing my discoveries with Alejandra was a pleasure in and of itself. I heard her whispered exclamations of delight as I showed her the 3 cream-colored eggs in a siete colores nest, and silently pointed out the brown pato cappuccino, who didn't seem to have moved for 3 days. And I felt triumphant, like a playwright or director sitting in the audience on opening night. Except, of course, I hadn't staged any of it. It just was. Now that the sites were chosen and we knew where and where not to step, collecting samples went quickly, even in the pond. The Pollona Azul eggs had hatched, and when Alejandra saw the blue-green and when Alejandra saw the blue queen and her 3 black babies lined up on their floating empire, she thought surely that was the big surprise of the day. But no, I told her, it was just the warm-up act. The main act, I said, was less flamboyant and more interesting. We left her knapsack with the samples in the glade, and she looked skeptical when I told her we were going into the brush. But she followed me, uncomplaining. and when we got to my island of solid ground and I knelt down to watch for the rails, she followed suit. We could just barely see the nest with its little entry ramp, and I was tempted to clap and try to flush out the sitting bird so Alejandra could get a look. But the rails were so reclusive, I worried they'd abandon the nest if we disturbed them. I was hoping the mail would arrive with food, but they weren't even calling. It was like watching a movie that was stuck on its most boring frame, and it wasn't exactly comfortable kneeling there in the wet grass with the mosquitoes whining about our heads and drilling into any spot we'd missed with the repellent. Maybe we should go, I whispered, glancing over at Alejandra, who had her binoculars trained on the nest. But we waited another 5 minutes, and finally we heard the trilling vibrato of a rail calling from somewhere thick in the marsh. A pause, a few beats, and there was an answer from the nest. Another pause, and then there he was at the bottom of the ramp. He hopped left, hopped right, dashed up and crammed something into the nest, and then ran back into the weeds. Alejandra lowered the binoculars and turned toward me, her face radiant. It's that bird you were chasing. I guess he isn't as lonely as you thought. Right, I said, pleased that she remembered. Probably what I thought was one bird leading me around in circles was actually two. I pushed myself to my feet. Let's get out of here. It's getting late and I'm being eaten alive. What are they called? I don't know. They're not in the field guide. I think they must be in the rail family, but that's about all I can see. She wanted to see the field guide for herself, but I made her wait until we got out of the weeds before I would stop and extract it from my knapsack. She studied the illustrations of rails and quakes, reading the short descriptive text, paging forward into the coots and shorebirds, and backwards into the guans and birds of prey. None of these are it, she said finally. I told you, it's not in there. But this only covers Argentina or Uruguay. They probably wandered down from Brazil, but though it's hard to imagine rails going very far from home, you hardly ever see them fly, and when you do, it's just short little dashes down close to the ground, as if they're afraid to go too high. I have a colleague at the university, she said, who studies birds, Eduardo Schwartz. We can ask him. I've got a drawing you can show him in my journal, and a description. The sun was starting down, so we cut back through the pastures without stopping until we got to the rise above the house, where I caught the scent of wood smoke and sausages and a faint hint of cigarette smoke. They'd all be down there, I realized. Mom and Juan Luis and Ruben inaugurating the new parrillero. What was I thinking? Idiotically, I'd straightened up my room, made the narrow bed, folded my clothes, and set my few books out on the table Mom had set up. As if I was going to invite Alejandra to an asado with my mother and uncles, and then convince her, in this state of pre-seduction where every move was transparent and loaded with meaning, to spend the night with me there. I slowed my pace and then stopped, turning to gaze back over the tilting grassland toward the seemingly impenetrable mass of weeds and brush we'd exited. The sky was spectacular, wisp of cloud moving on the wind, orange and pink clashing with the endless green of pastures and marsh. Do you think they ever come out of there? Alejandra had stopped next to me and was following my gaze. What, the rails? They like to stay hidden, but they must have come from somewhere. I was gratified to see that even after all the afternoon's spectacular surprises, she was obsessed as I was by the timid little birds. Maybe they're not lost. She reached out to grip my forearm where it lay resting across my binoculars. Maybe the species has always lived in these marshes, before the rice, before the drainage projects. It could just be that no one ever noticed them. She was looking up at me intently, but I was too distracted by her tiny hand gripping my arm to answer. I laid my free hand over it and pressed it hard against my arm, so I could feel it, so it couldn't escape. Then I leaned down to kiss her, slowly now, on the lips and beyond the lips. A kiss so perfectly tuned and timed it seemed we had been practicing it our entire lives. When it ended, we were both shivering, though whether from cold or elation or anticipation was unclear. She was wearing a thin sweater, and I pulled her up against me, hiding her from the biting wind, her arms folded up between us and mine crossed awkwardly above her knapsack. I rested my chin in her lush hair and watched the sun settle over the horizon, and we stood like that for I don't know how long, before she wiggled free, and we continued across the pasture toward the house. Someone would have seen them, I said, finally coming back to her suggestion that the rails had always been there. It's not like with your bacteria. You don't just discover a new species of bird just like that in some backyard marsh in Uruguay. People have been watching birds for centuries. All the early explorers and natural historians were cataloging them. Banks, Humboldt, Darwin, Wallace, that guy who lived in Uruguay, W.H. Hudson. Amateurs, scientists, everyone looked at birds. Maybe there are some tropical species that escape detection hidden deep in the jungles of Africa or Brazil, but not here. People live out here. Juan says the nutria hunters used to go all over these marshes in canoes. You think a nutria hunter would have noticed these little birds? They're not exactly easy to spot, even when you're looking for them. Despite my skepticism, the idea thrilled me. I felt lightheaded, blessed, walking across the grassland with Alejandra spinning along by my side, and this shared knowledge between us. These two little birds that only she and I knew were there.
I'm struck by how both of these writers take us into the moment so skillfully and in such different ways. And I'm also curious about this idea of crossing genres. They both write in these brackish waters of science and art. Could you, before we read again, could you take a couple of minutes and talk about that? Tell us about how your work fits into these overlapping genres of science, poetry, fiction, storytelling.
Well, I think about story as sort of illustration of the sciences. I think that if science can be carried by the wealth provided in a story, such as what you hear, this beautiful reading by Susan, poetry maybe to a less extent, but in a similar way, there's a visual element and a real sort of tangible feeling of a character moving through a space, and so you hopefully can pull in a little bit of that science at the same time while that character is in that process of discovery or characters. And I see it in a very similar way. I think that developing my poems are primarily narrative poems, so just that the thrill of the knowledge, the thrill of the fact that you can go into this magical realm, in my case, of a post-fire forest where nobody would suspect these incredibly rare birds just come back. And the first time, of course, I didn't start writing right away. I said, if I don't take photos, no one's going to believe me. So I started with the photos and the footage, and then of course jumped right into the writing. Flashback as soon as I go through the photos when I'm back. So.
Yeah, so for me, it's interesting, Maya. For me, I was sort of introduced as a scientist, but I abandoned that career decades ago, actually. But my training seems to have influenced the way I see the world. And so for me, science is a way of seeing the natural world. We often don't think of it that way. We think of science and technology and making things and making vaccines. And I think for me, and from what I read also for you, Maya, science is a way of understanding the natural world, even if we're talking about chemistry. So that naturally works its way into my fiction. I didn't plan it that way, but the other thing is, in fiction, we're writing about all kinds of things. We're not just writing about science. I'm writing about all the things that literature has always dealt with: love and family and politics and history. And science is integral to every issue that we deal with that we've dealt with in the 20th and 21st centuries, at least. So I'm actually surprised that more people weren't doing this in the past. And my books are particularly heavy on the science, and there's a term that my friend Jean Hegel and I came up with to describe these books, where you're reading a novel and enjoying a story, and you're learning about some obscure field of knowledge, whether it's science or Shakespearean scholarship or whatever, that you knew nothing about through the story. And we started calling them nerd novels. Well, I never expected to find anything like this in poetry. I just was blown away when I started reading Maya's poems, And all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, I didn't know that. I just learned something about fire ecology. And I didn't know I was learning it. And I don't really know how she does that magic in the few words that she puts on the page, but I'm wondering if you could read us one of those poems. I have one in mind.
Sure. Susan was thinking about smoke detecting beetles, so I'd love to, they have smoke detectors on their antennae, and I still almost can't believe that the precision with which they arrive right after a fire into an intact landscape that's still sort of smoldering a little bit, and then they're the cue for the woodpeckers is a cue for the other birds, and then the goshawks arrive, and then the eagles, and then everybody else. So it's sort of, they start the chain. Smoke detecting beetles. In answer to drifts of ash, to genetic unity, a current soars up in west. Clouds of longhorns, yellow velvets, fur sawyers, barely able to wait till the ashes cool, till the crackling lowers to a murmur of embers. Wings shimmer across the air thermals. 100 miles of ridgeline and vale, 100 more. The unheard music of migration. The fire-brushed lands call to them with refrains that took shape when the first trees were torched open by lightning millions of years ago. Their refrains beckon, smoke drifts and haze by day, fission eyes of stellar matter arranged like a cambered map by night. And the beetles yield, charged with hybrids of black and gold. Their wings are blurred with a flight that is so much about turbulence and fury, about mind over winged cloud, that it is less insects in flight than the hurrying of a black-veined river, less a wing-beaten composite of airborne probabilities than an electric gale, less mass migration than an a cappella more ancient than decision.
So, poetry and novels, fiction, do really different things. And I'm going to, again, I'm apologizing, it's quite a bit longer, but I'm not quite as long as the last section. I'm going to try and read you a section of the scientific content of accidentals. And a novel is messier. I have a lot more room for expository. One has to be careful with that. And in accidentals, I have a couple of scientist characters who, from whom we, along with Gabe, can learn. So that's what I played with in this novel. So I'm going to read you a really rather science-dense bit. And this is earlier in the book than what you just heard. Alejandra and it's recently after Alejandra and Gabriel have met. The first time that he's going out with her to help her collect samples in the rice fields around his family's land. And they're in the car, and he asks her to tell him a little bit about what she's doing, what the study is that she's working on. And she gives him sort of the Reader's Digest version, but of course he's trying to get this woman interested in him, and so he wants to show that he's interested in her work. So he asks her for more. We were out of the city now, on the uneventful stretch of highway between Montevideo and Rocha. So, let's have the long version, I said. She shot me a look, her face a caricature of skepticism. Hey, it's a long drive, I said. She laughed then, and as she started into what promised to be an extended monologue, I knew I'd found the right topic. Say we find a nitrate-producing bug that thrives in the rice paddies. I forgot to tell you that bug is a microbiologist's pet term for bacteria and microbes. So if we find a nitrate-producing bug that thrives in the rice paddies, that's the form of nitrogen most plants need, nitrate. It might seem straightforward enough to grow this bug in cultures in the lab and then dump the cultures into the fields instead of adding a bunch of expensive, useless, polluting fertilizer. But chances are, we won't be able to grow our microbe in culture. And even if we can, and we dump it into the fields, it's questionable that it will thrive in greater numbers or produce more nitrate than it would have if we hadn't done anything. And even if it does thrive and starts producing nitrate like crazy, chances are there are other bugs that will snatch up the nitrate and convert it back to nitrite, and still others that will turn the nitrite into nitrogen, neither of which do the rice any good. That's actually what happens when the growers use nitrate fertilizers. They think they're feeding the crop, but they're just feeding the microbes. It's the bugs who have the last word. If you want to regulate nutrients in a rice paddy, you've got to pay attention to them. And not just one species or even a group, you have to manage the whole community, regulate the ecology. And how do you do that? I said. She paused and I wanted her to know I was listening, that I was interested. Oh, with great difficulty. You can try to regulate the amount of oxygen in the water, or the acidity, or the dry periods between crops, or the decay of organic matter, the rice straw after harvest. Timing is crucial. You want certain communities to take over at certain times of year. And these jars of mud you're collecting? Oh, they're full of little surprises. I try to culture some of them in the lab. There could be hundreds of species in there that we know nothing about, with as many different tasks and niches. The only bacteria I'd ever seen were a bunch of little splotches on the microscope slide in my high school biology class. But to hear Alejandra talk, they were as beautiful as a flock of roseate spoonbills on the wing in the setting sun, as varied as the entire plant and animal kingdoms. She told me about bugs that consumed oxygen and needed light, and others who ate carbohydrates from rotting plants and turned out sulfur, and still others who lived off the sulfur. About bugs that lived deep in the mud where there was no oxygen and released methane, and others near the surface who imbibed the methane as it bubbled upward. In the microbial world, Alejandra said, your waste is someone else's food, and your food is someone else's waste. You have these cycles like cogged wheels in the layers of mud and water. The cycles in the mud geared with the ones in the muddy water, and then those with the clear water, and those with the air. It's sort of like the way a city is linked to a state, which is linked to a country, which is linked to the world.
We want to keep listening, but I'm just going to take us through a quick transition here. These writers write about loss, and underneath loss is grief. And we're all thinking a lot about grief. We celebrated a horrible anniversary yesterday, an event that made us feel differently about the world. The past few years, we've experienced the grief and loss that go along with climate change impacts. We've had personal and family losses, and we're dealing with the persistence of this little microbe. Not the bug in the marsh, the one in our lungs. And yet these two writers take us into grief and loss, and then they march us right into hope. And that's a beautiful thing about their work. And would you like, it's almost 1:15, would you like to chat about that a little bit or go right into another reading?
I would move to, we have two really short bits now that I think would answer to what you just said quite nicely, and then we can open up the discussion. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, I've been a little obsessed with deforestation, so I'm going to share that. It's happening in the most unexpected places around the corner from us, sort of right under our noses. So this poem is both a note of grief and also, in spite of the fact that it's not here right in this poem, there is an underlying hope. So this one it's called Deforestation. By evening, the mountains are women wrapped in dark shawls. They sit hunched over embers, The quiet exchange spans the ages and the present. The living, no less or nothing. We are restless as wind streaking the sky with cirrus and smoke. We are no more than a moment of phoebes and bluebirds rising and falling to their thin, plaintive ribbons of sound. The path ahead is a lantern of minutes sputtering out. Smells of resin and freshly slashed cedar stain the end of days. If only our miles were not drained by battle, all hopes of listening gone to marauders, the briefest of petals falling through our hands. What will we say to the coming generations? Sun slipping down with all our time, aches starting to show cracks that widen as landslides, night grasses flattening under the blood of runoff, rivers losing their silver tongues to erosion, the world liquefied, racing down, few left to call it home.
Thank you, Maya. You know, we've been focusing on the science in these works, but I have to say Maya's poems punched me in the gut again and again. I've been grieving myself for the last few years with a very deep personal loss, and your poems hit me every time. So I don't know whether Accidentals offers hope or not. You have to get to the end of the book and decide for yourself. Thank you, Ray. The little bit I'm going to read you comes from very close to the ending, but I think I can read it without giving too much away. I chose it because it sort of encompasses personal and existential grief that Gabe is going through at this point in the story. You need to know a couple things. I don't remember what you need to know. Actually, I can tell you. You need to know, this is very near the end of the book, and Gabe's just had a conversation with his mother, Lily, where he's learned some family history that he's very upset about and extremely angry with his mother. And they're out at the estancia when she tells him this. I ran out into the yard and puked into the dusk, coughing up the beer and salad and empanadas I just consumed, startling Angelito, who must have been lying next to the door. Sorry, there's one other thing you need to know. Angelito is the name of a pet nandu, and a nandu is a South American ostrich, a rhea. There's a picture of him on the front without his head. Don't talk to me about that, that was the illustrator's idea. Okay, so that's Angelito. Yes. I startled Angelito, who must have been lying next to the door. Gabe. She'd followed me out, and now she reached to hug me, but I took a step back and shook my head. In such an incoherent froth of rage and incomprehension, I feared I might slap her. I turned and started walking away, and then I was running, stumbling across the yard in the moonlight, across the Teros field and up the incline toward the creek, her cries following me, a doleful keening calling my name, the name of a dead man, a phantom. I ran into the reeds loomed up in front of me, and only as I plunged into them did I realize that Angelito was with me. I stopped and stepped back into the open, giving him a push toward home. Go, I pleaded, tears flooding into a reed cut on my face, the welcome burn of salt and wound, though I hadn't known I was crying. He stood stock still. I felt around on the ground for a pebble and threw it at him. He trotted a few paces, stopped. I found another pebble and another, and then I showered him with small rocks and mud clods until he finally trotted off the way we'd come and left me to my own self-flagellating path. It was darker among the reeds, and I moved blindly forward at the full mercy of contradictory impulses, letting the reeds slide unimpeded into my face, tempting the marsh to swallow me, but moving along the path of least resistance, vaguely aware that my mindless flight had a destination. The pool was glistening in the moonlight, its occupants asleep in the shadows, indifferent as I made my way past them into the black heart of the marsh, grabbing at branches and yanking myself free with adrenaline-fueled efficiency each time the ground gave way and the macabre, otherworldly suck of quicksand threatened to bring me down. I knew the way too well, and it was no accident that I found the little island near the rail's dismantled nest. I collapsed in the grass and slept. I dreamed a collage of homesickness, the smell of redwood humus curled up in the damp, fire-hollowed heart of a giant tree, rain in the woods. Grandpa Gordon grinning with a California condor perched on his head. Dad tossing M&Ms over the back of his backpack for me to catch as we climbed on a steep trail, and the froth of Pacific waves rolling back into a receding ocean, washing it all away, leaving me with a self that was as blank as the wet sand, a flock of sanderlings scurrying across it in random patterns, but leaving no footprints. I awoke to a feeling of loss and denial so profound it would have driven me back into my confused dream, but for the hollow wail of a certain familiar species of bird, unnervingly close. I lay still, listening to the trills running repeatedly down the scale like a skipping CD, opening my eyes on a dark so intense it rendered the action irrelevant, registering wet clothes and cut face and mosquito bites, physical indifference, mental lethargy. The moon must have set, and the dawn was nowhere apparent. It was too dark to see anything but the tiny patch of stars that blinked through an opening in the brush above where I lay. The rails sounded so close, I thought they might run across my outstretched arm. I could even hear the delicate peeping of chicks between the trills, which seemed to encircle me, overlapping and coinciding, syncopated in a way I'd never heard them, to my right, to my left, behind my head, as if I were lying in the middle of a trio of trilling bassoons. "Do you have a name for yourself?" I whispered, or maybe I just thought it. Lateralis, or ralis, or parduralis, or something else entirely? Do you know who you are? Is that a thing you know in your access ramp building bird brains, who you are? What science has yet to discover? They started moving away from me, fading gradually into the marsh in 3 directions. Finally, they stopped calling altogether, and for a while, the night was almost as quiet as it was dark.
That's the last reading we have on our schedule. And we're going to start questions. You all don't have a mic. If you want help, I can bring the mic a little ways up, or if you shout out your question, we can repeat it so everyone can hear. Please.
I'm intrigued with the smoke detecting beetle. I have a few questions. One, where are they found? And in the evolution of its species, why would they need to detect smoke if they go to a place where there was fire? They're not trying to avoid it, is that correct?
Yeah, they're not trying to. So I should try to repeat your question. You're basically intrigued by the smoke detecting beetles and why they would actually dive in where the fire's just been.
And where are they? And what advantage does detecting smoke have in their evolution?
Yeah, all great questions. So, of course, lightning and fire have been as old as the tree, much older than the trees. So the trees, the forests, the chaparral, the grasslands have all co-evolved with fire, sort of doing this dance over the ages, which some call, they're changing right now with climate change, of course. but fire is still a need. It's like rain, fire and rain. And so the bugs, the beetles, the insect world has learned that the trees get weaker when they're burned. And so that's the place to go and lay their eggs. So they have these little smoke detectors that go out there into Sierra Nevada, Lower Cascades, probably Rockies. It's all over the American West. It's probably all over the world. But the ones I'm most familiar with, the Longhorns, Sawyers, etc., they're all over our American West. All the way to Idaho, Colorado, etc., where fire is intrinsically a part of the landscape, sort of like rain. It always has been. So yeah, they just go in and seek out the little areas where there's dead snags, which are later going to be the granaries for woodpeckers and other birds. So it's the start of a chain of beautiful events, and it starts with that dead wood.
Thank you.
More questions?
I was just wondering if you were familiar with another Sonoma County scientist, Sarah Andrews and Lillian Brighton. Yeah, she wrote a whole series of scientific texts disguised as murder mysteries.
Yes, she's a geologist. I do know her work. She's a mystery writer, and I think she's part of this now about a decade ago. And she wrote a whole series of popular mysteries, where the main character is a geologist and gets into all kinds of trouble, and they're great fun. And there's a lot of science in those novels. I should point you to, I would say in the last 20 years, there's been a sort of surge in this kind of fiction, or I should say that science has been finding its way into more and more mainstream fiction, not just what we think of as science fiction, which was often, about space adventures and sort of futuristic things. And I've been, for the last, decade, I've been leading a program called Fiction Meets Science. It's a university-based program in Germany, where I'm just moving back from. And we have a website, and on the website you'll find a database where you can search novels about all kinds of scientific topics and fields. So I mean, some examples that you'll be familiar with, of course, is most of Richard Powers' books. His most recent, The Overstory, which was quite popular, and if you're interested in trees, you should definitely read The Overstory. Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, about climate change. Some you probably don't know about would be, one of my favorites is Simon Maurer's Mendel's Dwarf, which blends the history of genetics and contemporary genetic engineering. There's a whole slew of these marvelous novels, and on the website we don't do much quality control, so there's kind of everything in there. But I would say most of them are literary novels. Even some of you may know Anthony Doerr's best-selling All the Light We Cannot See. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a nerd novel by our definition, but it's just saturated in scientific knowledge of snails and radio physics. And his earlier work, which I've been reading for years, does this also. So yeah, there's a whole rich literature that has been paying attention to science.
So we've heard a lot of science tonight, but we've also heard a lot of emotion and a lot of beautiful language and narrative. And the way both of you put that together is wonderful. What do you want people to take away from your work? Is it the narrative, the science, the balance? What matters to you? What's important there?
I think what matters to me is seeing beauty and value in a place that can look and feel very misunderstood. It's sort of, for me, that's been my focus. These are areas that are, well, quite frankly, about 8 years ago, I walked through one area with fallen trees and beetle kill and little burnt sections, and I thought, oh well, it's ruined. you know, and you know, I know so much more right now about that. So I think for me, what I would hope that you would take away, everyone, is this incredibly magical, mysterious world of birds, and I hope you will, of course, take that message from Susan's writing as well, which is incredible, and also the value of something we don't value, that has this intrinsic value in it just because it is.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a question that when this literature started coming to attention, a lot of scientists and people got really excited because they said, "Oh, this is this new kind of science communication. You know, people can read a novel and learn all this stuff." And I'm really uncomfortable with that, actually. If I wanted to teach people about science, I would not be writing novels. I'd be writing popular science nonfiction, or like Maya has done, making documentaries, doing some more straightforward expository work. I'm writing a novel, so I want people to take away from that novel the intersection between all these human issues and the scientific issues. And if anything, probably the beauty of the science. So if you read Carbon Dreams, I want you to come away understanding the beauty of organic chemistry. I'm not necessarily going to give you a test on anything in that book, but I want you to have a sense of how the processes of science, how we think, how we see the world. I guess that would be my takeaway for the scientific content, but it's hard for me to separate that out from the overall themes and topics of the novels. I mean, they're novels, they're stories. I want you to have a good time.
Thank you to both of you. We were Zooming a couple of days ago, getting ready for this, and I was reflecting that because I've just known Maya for a little while, but I've known Susan a long time, and actually read some drafts of Accidentals and Carbon Dreams. And
Lots of drafts.
a few. The thing about these writers is they share their knowledge with you in such an easy way. When I read their work, I feel smarter. And it's an extraordinary gift. It's breaking down that barrier and giving that knowledge to you so effortlessly. Please Google both of them. Please check out Fiction Meets Science online. Check out Maya's documentaries and the work she's doing up in Mill Creek Watershed and other places. And please become a member of the Occidental Center for the Arts if you're not. We are just a minute past 5 o'clock. I see another question.
Just that an opportunity, one concern that I've had with these fires is what I'm hearing experts say, that the fires are so hot they're destroying the soil. Can you address that, please?
I hope I can one day address the heat of fires and then the idea that they're destroying the soil in a poem. It's just going to be so challenging to put so much material in it. It's a very popular notion that the fires are really intense and hot. They're getting hotter. And right now, the places where I'm noticing the most change, and where, you know, fire, how do you know that the fire was hot or not? You're not there, right? So the indicator is, you know, you got a swath of trees. All of a sudden, you're walking along, and these trees are all recovering, and they're showing up. They're good. They're making a comeback. And then all of a sudden, you walk into a patch, and no, those trees are not showing up. They're not making a comeback. That was a hot patch. And then you go to another one, and it's really patchy in the untouched forest. The ones that are where those patches I've found to be really big, where you think, oh no, these are not coming back so far. I mean, they might, maybe to give them 2 years, is the areas that have been logged. And so Dixie fire, Caldor, up in Tahoe fire, Bootleg fire. A friend and colleague has been making these maps of where the fires hit the fastest and most ferocious. Well, we can't say really how exactly hot until you walk it and see how many, dead and alive, and then you can say, oh yeah, this patch burned hot. These trees are not coming back. But yeah, invariably we're seeing that this area with past logging activity or thinning activity is burning very hot. We've just got the data for it. You can actually, one area just like swept miles and miles within one afternoon. That's just unheard of for a speed of a fire. And it's hot and fast. So, and then the other thing about the microbes, I just want to say I have in the high intensity fire patches that are the hot ones that you're talking about, that I've studied, that are intact forests, every single one of them, you've got beautiful expression of these young trees. I wish I brought my poster. I have it right outside. In fact, I'll run and get it after this is over. With these little sprigs showing up everywhere. The mycorrhizal fungal interactions are intact. It's just, you can see that, I have friends who are mycologists who know much better more than about that. But no, those are not destroyed areas. But where there has been a lot of this pre-fire disturbance, sadly, we feel like we're well-meaning. You want to go in there and you want to treat it, you want to thin it, you want to take care of it, but it's sort of loving it to death because then it burns so hot. It's just all dried out, right, with all that mechanical stuff going on, and then the fire just like races through, and that does actually really affect those areas. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Were you going to ask a question?
I was going to comment more. We can recognize, we think about it, that scientists are people too. And a high proportion of scientists, in my experience, also read good literature. I don't think there's a reciprocal relationship among the humanists and scientific literature. Other contexts, scientists have been telling stories to each other and have developed pretty arcane language in order to be unambiguous and efficient at it. And one of the biggest impediments to humanists reading science is that they don't learn another language. Damn it, I had to learn 2 languages to get my PhD. There are languages, but what I'm impressed about in Susan's books is how beautifully integrated and interwoven are the scientific concepts, which don't need special language to get across. And the human emotions and the life. Scientists don't generally try to affect your emotions. So they leave some possibilities aside and do something really good.
I'll just make a brief comment. It's interesting because when my first novel, Carbon Dreams, was first published, way back in, well, it's my second novel, but way back in 2001, and it's a story. It's a climate change novel before people were writing climate change novels. It's a story of a young scientist who gets caught up in the media debates about climate change in the 1980s, and it was a cult hit among scientists and geochemists, as you can imagine. And I went and gave a talk at. I was invited to give a reading at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which you don't really think of a place where you would give a reading from a novel. And the scientists in the audience were saying that the book gave them a chance to do exactly what they can't do in their professional lives, which was to talk about all the human sides of doing science. It also gave them a chance to admit that they were all raging environmentalists, but didn't dare admit it. That has changed, I must say. Most of the climate scientists I know now are raging activists because they're so damn scared. But in those days, that wasn't the case. Yeah.
And I saw a hand over here.
So, just Maya, could you speak briefly about your documentary work and what you're trying to do?
Yeah, sure. So the question was about speaking very briefly about my documentary work. Actually, really, I'm not by any stretch a documentary filmmaker. I have to say this, my family would laugh if they saw me saying I'm a filmmaker, but they are filmmakers. But when I first walked into the post-fire forests, I really got that sort of gut-wrenching feeling. This is incredible and magical, and everything is popping and growing. Every other biologist was saying, this is where the life is. We wondered where it was, and it's all here, that kind of thing. So the first thing I thought was, no one's going to believe me if I don't document this on film. And so I had a little camera, one of those PowerShot Canons. It had a good zoom. It was only HD, but it had a good zoom. And so when you see any of those films, like, on the website I have a couple of little pieces, and Rejuvenation is a poem that's on film. And I get up close, but I don't really. It's a nice zoom that I have. I just sort of sit in a little blind and, for hours and get that the birds just sort of forget about me, and that's how I can. A lot of them also I'm trying to, interview firefighters and fire scientists who are really concerned about home safety, and it's just the basics for us. What do we do? Yeah, we can accept fire all we want, but what are we going to do? That kind of thing. And so I'm really interested in sort of starting at the home front and then sort of going out. So that's the gist of a lot of what I do.
And a hand in the back.
Yeah, just as a follow-up about your work. So will you have a finished product to then put forth? Because I think I've seen iterations of it at other talks. Or will you just post it on your website, or will there be something at the Summerfield or the?
Oh, you the films?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I'm definitely working on at least one. Well, I have Searching for the Gold Spot. That's half an hour, and it was out a while ago.
Right.
Green Planet's distributed it. It's about. It's very much about chasing the black-backed woodpecker. This is getting more and more rare. And then there's all these other little nuggets that are online right now. I'd like to, weave them together for sure. Hopefully Summerfield. I'm not sure about that.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to express this, but I was listening to a talk today about how there are so many people who are influenced by things that are not scientific. We're hearing a lot of discussion of people who have these very out there beliefs that they just picked up from the internet. But it seems like if there was more science integrated reading that was popular, maybe more people would be accepting of science.
Yeah, this is kind of one of the premises of Fiction Meets Science. We actually support writers who want to do their homework and come for residency, and we hook them up with local scientists so they can do the background readings. It's a very fine line we walk, at least in fiction. It's really interesting because I see Maya's poems as nonfiction. But in fiction, it's a very fine line we walk. Like I said, it's not science communication. So there's a certain responsibility to the subject matter. I mean, I might fictionalize the science to fit my story. But I have to find ways to cue you in so you can, so that the basics are plausible and real. And I often add an afterword pointing you to, where I fictionalize the story or where you can go for further information. But it can work the other way. I mean, one of the books that had the largest negative impact on the climate change debate was Michael Crichton's horrendous State of Fear, which was published in the mid-2000s, I think. And partly because he was such a well-known writer and so popular, it's basically a climate denialist science fiction story, but it's framed like a science novel. It's framed like my novels. It's got footnotes, and he carries the law. He turns it into basically a very elaborate law. He carries it on into the afterward. Well, Michael Crichton was invited to speak before Congress, along with scientists. He had no background in this field. He's just a novelist making up these stories. So, and people were convinced. I mean, I hear people quote that book to me, and I'm like, wait, this was this weird novel, you know? So it's a fine line we walk between how we responsibly, as artists, deal with the science. I mean, we deal with any material. Like most of the novelists I know do a lot of background research for everything that's in the book. I mean, if I'm setting something in Montevideo, I better damn well know what Montevideo looks like, so that someone who comes from there isn't going to be popped out of the story because, you know, I've got this monument on the wrong corner or something. And of course, we're doing that with the science too. But I feel an extra responsibility to science because of the type of knowledge it is. So yeah.
Sure.
I suppose a little bit along that line, I mean, I think there's the study of human systems, and I was always informed about evolution. And we had these stories just about parts of human history, and they were fiction, but they were threaded, I think, was the facts. So the stories about Israel, and then stories about South Africa, where I come from. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. It was about human systems. Stories about human civilization or human groups. And I think this fits into that. How do some human groups get so far away from reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's historical fiction basically, which has a lot, I mean, there's a lot going on there that's very similar to what we do in these science novels. And again, I think it has to do with how we as a society, how we as a culture, it's basically our education. How do we read? And how do we understand fiction? So you read a historical novel and you know you're reading a novel, you know, or we used to. But I can't say that that's the case anymore. You know, I mean, that's what's been happening in our society. There's no longer a consensus about what's fact-based, evidence-based reality and what's art, fiction, and what's a lie. Those have been merged. So I don't know what happens to this kind of literature and that kind of ambiance.
And
I think there was one more question.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here. It's like this is custom made for me. I'm a nature and wildlife photographer who photographs birds, and I have a science background. So it's really great. And I want to encourage everybody to go walk in a bird forest. I spent time 2 years ago walking in the forest in Eugene Sheriff photographing black woodpeckers. So what comes to me is in change there's opportunity. Even though we don't like to change sometimes.
And there's a thread in here about truth. And we've all heard that cliche about you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own set of facts. And there's these, thinking about Maya's poetry, there's these truths that are almost sacred truths that she's using her poetry to inspire us, but also to teach us. Is that intentional?
Maybe. To confess. It's like making a discovery and being really excited. Hey, here. It's amazing. That kind of thing.
Well, we want to be thoughtful about your time. Some of you will be driving home in the dark. And the authors are going to stay around a bit. Their books for sale, and they'd love to chat with you and sign one for you. And again, thank you to the Occidental Center for the Arts. Thank you to all of you for coming out.